Most men don't break the moment she chooses someone else. Not really. The real break happens 3 months later, 6 months later, when their phone lights up with her name again. Because that message does something dangerous to a man's mind. It reopens every conversation he forced himself to survive without. Every night he pretended he was moving on. Every lie he told his friends. Every gym session that was secretly fueled by anger. Every cold little sentence he repeated to himself just to sleep. She made her choice. And then suddenly, she's texting me. You can feel your heartbeat changing before you even open it. And if you're the kind of man who has ever stared at a screen trying to decode what a woman really means, then stay with me for this one. Seriously, subscribe if you want more conversations like this, because some of the things we talk about here are the kind you usually only hear behind closed doors, late at night, when people finally stop pretending. Because what hurts isn't always rejection. Sometimes what hurts more is being remembered. See, men imagine this fantasy where the woman who left finally realizes she made a mistake. They picture regret, longing, some dramatic emotional awakening. But real life is quieter than that, more confusing, and honestly, more painful. Because sometimes she comes back without actually coming back. That's the part nobody prepares you for. A man can spend months rebuilding himself after being left. He learns how to function without hearing her voice. He stops checking her stories, stops rereading old messages, stops wondering who she's with. At least, on the surface. But emotionally, a part of him stays frozen in the moment she chose someone else over him. And women feel that freeze. They do. Not in some mystical way, not because women are mind readers, but because emotional memory leaves fingerprints on people, especially when the connection was real. You want to know something difficult? A woman often reaches back out when she finally feels your absence emotionally, not when you were begging her to notice it. That timing destroys men psychologically, because when you wanted her, she felt distant. When you finally started healing, suddenly she appears again, and now your brain is split in half. One side remembers the pain, the other remembers the possibility. That internal war can consume a man for months, especially if he never truly understood why she left in the first place. See, a lot of men think attraction disappears in one dramatic moment. It usually doesn't. It fades quietly, in tiny emotional ruptures nobody talks about. The relationship becomes emotionally predictable. Conversations lose tension. He starts performing stability instead of presence. She starts feeling emotionally alone while technically not being alone. And the terrifying part? Most men don't notice it happening because men are taught to measure relationships logically. We don't fight much. I'm loyal. I show up. I do the right things. But emotional connection is not a checklist. A woman can appreciate you deeply and still stop feeling pulled toward you. That truth is brutal for good men, especially the ones who genuinely tried. And when she chooses someone else, the mind immediately searches for a villain. Him, her, yourself. But real emotional shifts are usually more complicated than betrayal narratives people post online. Sometimes she didn't leave because you were weak. Sometimes she left because somewhere along the way, the emotional current between you died, and neither of you knew how to revive it. That's why her message later feels so unsettling, because now you're forced to ask a question you were avoiding. If she missed me, why did she leave? And deep down, you already know the answer probably won't fit into one clean sentence. The message usually arrives at a strange hour. Not always late at night like people imagine. Sometimes it's 2:17 in the afternoon while you're standing in line for coffee. Sometimes it's during work. Sometimes it appears on an ordinary Tuesday that was finally starting to feel peaceful again. That's what makes it hit so hard. Your nervous system had just begun to trust silence, and then suddenly, her name. You stare at it longer than you should, long enough for old emotions to wake up before logic can stop them. And the worst part? The message is almost never dramatic. That's what confuses men. It's casual, soft, almost emotionally innocent. Hey, I know this is random. Saw something today that reminded me of you. Hope you're doing okay. 3 harmless sentences. But those sentences can unravel months of emotional recovery in under 10 seconds. Because men don't just read words from women they loved, they read possibility. That's why some of you torture yourselves trying to analyze punctuation, timing, sentence length, whether she used your nickname, whether she typed hey or hey. You think you're decoding her, but really, you're trying to protect yourself from hope. There's a difference. And women often underestimate how emotionally destabilizing their return can feel to a man who genuinely loved them, especially if she left him carrying unanswered questions. See, women process emotional disconnection differently than men do. A lot of men suppress pain until it hardens. Women often process pain while still emotionally engaged with life. So while you were trying not to collapse privately, she may have already gone through several emotional stages before sending that message. That doesn't make her cruel. It just means emotional timing between men and women is often tragically misaligned. And here's the part that stings. Sometimes she reaches out not because she wants the relationship back, but because she finally has enough emotional distance to feel your values safely. You have no idea how common this is. When she was with you, your consistency became invisible to her nervous system. Familiar, predictable, emotionally quiet. Then life moves on. The new person isn't what she imagined. The chemistry feels unstable. Or maybe it's exciting, but emotionally hollow. And suddenly your steadiness becomes emotionally visible again. Not because you changed overnight, but because absence creates contrast. Humans don't understand emotional security until they experience emotional inconsistency. That's true for men too, by the way. But here's where men destroy themselves emotionally. They assume her message automatically means, "She realized I was the one." No. Sometimes the message simply means, "You mattered more than I allowed myself to feel at the time." Those are not the same thing. And if you don't understand the difference, you'll walk straight back into the exact pain that almost broke you the first time. Because a woman missing your presence does not automatically mean she's prepared to choose you differently. Read that again internally, slowly. A woman can miss you, care about you, think about you often, and still not be emotionally ready to build a healthy relationship with you. That contradiction is difficult for men because men often experience love more linearly. If a man deeply loves a woman, his instinct is usually, "Then let's fix it." Women are often more emotionally fragmented than that. A woman can love you and still feel emotionally confused, still feel afraid, still feel disconnected from herself, still repeat unhealthy patterns she intellectually understands but emotionally hasn't healed. And honestly, that's where many men accidentally lose themselves. They fall in love with emotional potential instead of emotional reality. The message becomes a doorway back into fantasy. You start imagining the conversation, the apology, the reunion, her finally seeing you fully. Meanwhile, she may simply be lonely, reflective, curious, emotional, nostalgic, human. And nostalgia is dangerous because nostalgia edits memory. It removes tension, softens incompatibility, turns loneliness into destiny. That's why men reopen old relationships thinking they're returning to love, when sometimes they're only returning to emotional familiarity. And familiarity can feel almost identical to love when you've been lonely long enough. There's a moment in this kind of message that nobody talks about honestly. It's not when you read it, it's what happens after. When the screen goes dark again, when the room feels exactly the same as it did 5 minutes ago, but you don't. Something inside you has already shifted position, and now you're negotiating with yourself. Not out loud, quietly, like two versions of you sitting in the same chair. One version says, "Don't respond, you already know how this ends." The other says, "But what if this is different this time?" And that second voice, it never sounds irrational in the moment. That's the problem. It sounds reasonable, even responsible. You can at least be polite. You don't have to ignore her. You're not a bitter person. See how that works? It doesn't come as temptation, it comes as identity. And that's how men who swore they were done end up back in conversations they promised themselves they'd never restart. But here's something uncomfortable I've seen over and over in real emotional patterns. The real danger isn't her message. It's what her message awakens in you. Because if she still has emotional access to you, it usually means there's an unclosed loop inside you that never fully resolved. Not just love, unfinished meaning. You never fully understood what you were to her at the end. You might have understood what she said. You might have accepted the breakup. But emotionally, the story didn't land cleanly. And humans struggle with that more than rejection itself. We can survive, no. What we struggle with is not knowing exactly why. So when she returns, even briefly, your mind doesn't just see a person. It sees an opportunity to rewrite the ending, to finally make sense of it, to get clarity where there was confusion. But clarity is not guaranteed in these conversations. Sometimes you don't get answers. Sometimes you get more ambiguity dressed up as emotional softness. And I need you to hear this carefully. Not every reconnection is a resolution. Some reconnections are just echoes. They sound familiar, but they don't actually lead anywhere new. And the painful irony is, the more emotionally invested you were, the more convincing the echo feels. You start interpreting small signals as depth, a slightly longer reply, a memory she brings up, a question about your life, and suddenly your brain begins constructing a narrative again. Not because reality changed, but because hope is efficient. It fills gaps quickly, but it doesn't check accuracy. That's why men often describe these situations later with confusion in their voice. I thought she meant more. I thought she was coming back. I thought this time she was serious. And none of those thoughts are stupid. They're human responses to emotional reactivation. But emotional reactivation is not the same as emotional commitment. A moment of softness is not the same as a decision. And if you don't separate those two things, you'll mistake emotional warmth for direction. You'll follow a feeling that was never trying to lead you anywhere, just trying to pass through you. And the hardest truth here? Sometimes she isn't coming back to rebuild anything. She's coming back because you became real to her in your absence in a way you weren't allowed to be in your presence. And that realization can feel flattering at first, until you understand what it actually means. You were valued more clearly when you were no longer part of her life than when you were in it. There's a specific kind of silence that follows once you reply, even if it's just one message, even if it's casual. Hey, yeah, I'm good, how are you? That moment after you send it is where a lot of men lose emotional control without realizing it. Because now you're no longer just remembering her, you're re-entering the rhythm of her, and rhythm is powerful. People underestimate this. The tone of her replies, the timing, the gaps between responses. They start to regulate your emotional state again. You check your phone more than you want to admit. You tell yourself you're being chill, but your attention slowly reorganizes around her presence. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system remembers. It remembers what it was like to anticipate her, to decode her moods, to adjust yourself slightly so the connection didn't break. And that's where things get psychologically interesting, because what feels like connection returning is often actually your old adaptation patterns reactivating. You become slightly more careful with your words, slightly more aware of tone, slightly more invested in being understood correctly. And you might tell yourself, this feels good again. But sometimes what feels good is simply what feels familiar. And familiar is not always safe. Now listen carefully, because this is where men often misunderstand themselves. When she left, you didn't just lose her. You lost a version of yourself that existed inside that dynamic. The version of you that was always partly on alert, always partially emotionally tuned into her reactions, always measuring stability through her responses. And when she returns, even in small ways, that version of you tries to come back online. Not all at once, gradually, subtly. You don't notice it happening because it feels like emotional engagement. But internally, something else is happening too. You are becoming emotionally contingent again. And that's the dangerous shift, because emotional contingency always creates imbalance. One person starts carrying the emotional temperature of the interaction, the other simply participates in it. And in most reconnecting dynamics, the man becomes the one who starts over-investing emotionally, not because he wants to lose control, but because he remembers what it felt like to finally be chosen. That memory alone can distort present reality. You stop asking, "Is this actually good for me now?" and start asking, "How do I make this work this time?" Those are not the same question. One protects your stability, the other sacrifices it for hope. And here's something that surprises a lot of men when they're honest later. Even when the woman is kind, even when she's respectful, even when there is genuine care present, the emotional imbalance can still quietly return. Not because anyone is doing something wrong, but because the original dynamic was never fully healed. It was just paused. And paused dynamics resume easily. That's why these reconnections can feel so emotionally charged, but structurally unstable at the same time. You feel close, but not secure. Engaged, but not grounded. Seen, but not chosen in a clear way. And men often tolerate this grey area longer than they should, because grey area feels like possibility. But emotionally mature connection doesn't live in constant uncertainty. It clarifies itself. It doesn't keep you guessing about your place in it. And if you find yourself constantly analysing where you stand, what she means, whether this is going somewhere, that uncertainty is already information, not about her intentions, but about the structure of what is being rebuilt. And the question quietly becomes, are you reconnecting with a person? Or with a feeling you once had access to when she was part of your life? There's a point in these conversations where something subtle happens, and most men miss it completely. It's not an argument, it's not rejection, it's not even disappointment. It's emotional distance returning, quietly. You'll feel it in the pauses, in how she answers things she used to elaborate on, in how certain topics stay surface level now, in how she doesn't lean into the conversation the way she used to when things were emotionally alive between you. And your mind will try to explain it away. She's busy. She's different now. Maybe she's just tired. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes what you're sensing is simply this. The emotional space between you has not reopened in the same way. And here's where it gets psychologically painful for men. Because men often think reconnection is about access. If she's talking to you again, then access is restored. But emotional access doesn't work like that. A woman can give you conversation without giving you emotional openness. She can be polite without being emotionally present. She can even care about you without re-entering emotional intimacy. And that gap creates confusion that feels personal. You start thinking, what did I do wrong this time? But often nothing new happened. You're just seeing the reality of what the connection currently is, without the emotional fog of the past relationship filling in the gaps. And this is the moment where a man either stabilizes himself or slowly loses his emotional center again. Because now you're in the most dangerous phase, not rejection, not reunion, but ambiguity with emotional history attached. That combination is powerful. It makes the past feel like proof that the future can return. But history in relationships is not a promise. It's just context. And context can change without warning. Here's something I want you to sit with for a second. Just because someone remembers you fondly does not mean they are re-entering your life in the same way they once left it. People don't always come back as the same emotional role. Sometimes they come back as a softer version of closure, a gentler way of letting go, a way to revisit something unfinished without rebuilding it. And if you mistake that for renewal, you end up emotionally overinvested in something that was never trying to grow roots again. You just felt it growing because your own emotional memory filled in the space. That's what attachment does. It completes unfinished stories even when reality doesn't. And men rarely notice how quickly they start doing this when she reappears. They begin assigning meaning to small moments. A late-night message feels like intimacy. A memory she mentions feels like longing. A "hope you're okay" feels like emotional reopening. But none of those things by themselves define direction. They only reflect momentary emotional states. And emotional states change. Which is why relying on them for clarity will always keep you slightly off balance. At some point, you have to ask yourself something that isn't emotional at all. Not, does she still feel something? But, is there anything structurally different now that would prevent the same outcome from happening again? Because if nothing has actually changed in how the connection functions, then the story you're hoping to continue is just a more emotionally polished version of the one that already ended. And I know that's not the answer most people want. But clarity isn't supposed to feel comforting at first. It's supposed to stop repetition. At some point, you start to notice something that doesn't feel dramatic, but it's decisive. You stop feeling pulled. Not all at once. It happens in small interruptions. You don't rush to check your phone immediately after hearing a notification. You don't reread messages looking for hidden meaning. You don't feel that familiar tightening in your chest when her name appears. And it can confuse you at first, because part of you assumes that caring deeply should always feel intense. But emotional maturity often feels quieter than attachment. And here's what many men don't expect. The real turning point isn't when she chooses you. It's when you realize you don't need the emotional confusion anymore. Because confusion is expensive. It costs attention. It costs peace. It costs self-trust. And over time, a man begins to recognize that what he once called love was sometimes mixed with waiting, interpreting, hoping, recalibrating himself around uncertainty. And when that cycle slows down, something important returns. Not pride, not revenge, something steadier than that. Clarity. You begin to see her not as a question you need answered, but as a person whose presence in your life had a specific shape, a specific limit, and a specific emotional outcome. And that's when the message that once shook you starts to lose its power. Not because she became irrelevant, but because your nervous system stopped treating uncertainty as intimacy. And I want to be careful here because this is where people often misunderstand healing. Letting go doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you stopped negotiating with emotional patterns that were costing you more than they were returning. There's a quiet shift that happens in men when this settles. You stop needing to prove your worth in conversations where clarity is absent. You stop interpreting inconsistency as potential. You stop making emotional space for people who only occupy it intermittently. And something else happens too, something a little unexpected. You start remembering who you were before the emotional noise. Not in a nostalgic way, in a grounded way. The version of you that wasn't constantly analyzing tone, timing, or intent. The version of you that didn't lose sleep over mixed signals. The version of you that moved through life without needing emotional decoding to feel stable. That version doesn't come back because she left. It comes back because you stop feeding the loop that kept it buried. And if she sends another message after that shift, it won't hit the same way anymore. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become accurate. You'll read it for what it is instead of what it could be. And that distinction changes everything. Because most emotional pain in situations like this doesn't come from love itself, it comes from projection layered onto incomplete information. Once that layer falls away, what remains is simpler than you expected. Sometimes she missed you. Sometimes she felt something real. Sometimes she was uncertain too. But none of that automatically reconstructs what was already unstable. And that's the truth a lot of men eventually arrive at on their own, after enough cycles of hope and confusion. Not every return is a second chance. Some returns are just echoes of a chapter that already finished writing itself. And when you finally see that clearly, you stop waiting for the message to mean something more than what it actually is. And you start choosing yourself in a way that doesn't require emotional permission from the past anymore.